Good evening. So I was asked to come in and talk to you guys and spend a little time talking about some things that I'm interested in and some areas of research that I work in, both research and teaching. But I also don't want to flood the hour with just my voice, but leave enough time for us to actually have a little bit of a dialogue about the burning questions that you might have. So what I did is I kind of took some ideas that I think are relevant and applicable for you and come right out of the ways that I like to think about certain aspects of leadership and success, particularly in today's global economy. But then also cut that off probably after about 20 minutes or half an hour and open the floor and we can talk about whatever you guys want. So let me just start off by giving you a little bit of a background. It was a very nice introduction, but I can tell you a little bit about my own career because it tells us something about where this business school is going and what we're trying to prepare you for. When I took over this job a year ago, I got a number of questions from people in the media and people around academia about what is a guy who comes out of Chinese literature, humanities, being a dean of a business school. And I thought it was an interesting question. I think I'm happy that the university made the choice that they made. But the question is actually a really relevant one because it tells us something about where GW is and where we're going. So if you think about two converging forces that really matter in the global economy over the last 30 years, they are first and foremost globalization and the ways in which different emerging economies around the world really matter in some fundamental way for how the world economic system is shaping up. And the second one, to my mind, is really the issue of social responsibility and ethics of the corporation. We have lived in a world over, say, the last half a century in which corporations have grown to be the most powerful institutions in the global economy besides nation states. There are no institutions that hold the same type of position in our society besides nation states. And this is a very important thing about this institution because you all, probably 90% of you, are going to go out and be people within these organizations. You're going to be the engine of these organizations themselves. Now there's an overlying third trend to those two, the globalization piece and the power of corporations, that has been very specific to business schools and universities. And that is that I think I've been a fundamental believer in the idea, I'm not the only one, but I'm a little bit of a minority voice within business schools. Because I believe in the university system and I believe in university education and I believe in business schools, but I also feel like we've fallen down on our jobs a little bit over the last 30 years. We've followed the Pied Piper of neoclassical economic theory and became more and more disembedded from society. Who's the most famous economist from neoclassical economic theory? Who? Okay. Keynes is not a neoclassicist. Keynes is actually a Keynesian economist who believes in actually mixed economies. But who's Keynes' major countervailing voice? Friedman. Thank you. Milton Friedman. You should all know that name because Milton Friedman is the most influential voice. I mean, he's passed away now, but he won a Nobel Prize by the end of his career before he died. But he is hands down the most important economist of the 20th century because he has actually influenced the world that we live in today. And we can talk a little bit about how and why that has been and what that actually means. But the important thing to understand really is that business schools followed suit. Business schools threw in their lot with neoclassical economic theory, which essentially meant the market efficiency thesis is right, which is essentially that markets are self-correcting systems. And we don't need to really think about those forces that are external shocks to markets, namely states or radical cataclysmic social shocks to the system, because those are, once in a lifetime events, and what we really need to think about is just the idea that if we focus on what corporations do well and what the functional areas of business do well, we don't need to do much else besides that. Now that also coincided with the rise in the 1980s of the shareholder capitalism, which Milton Friedman was a big advocate of. And that, in some sense, dominated the late 70s, 80s, and early 90s. But then we started to see things happen in this economy. We started to see things like the economic crisis or the accounting crisis of 2000, 2001, in which, you guys are probably old enough to remember the early days of that, but 2000, 2001, we saw the fall of Enron, WorldCom, Tyco, major accounting scandals that brought down major accounting firms like Arthur Andersen. And if that wasn't enough, in 2000, 2008, we saw the economic crisis that really was the result of us sending students out into the world with very complex ideas about how to build complex instruments like mortgage-backed securities, but very little social context for what the implications or the impact of that could be. And you know what happens? $14 trillion of loss in global capitalization later. We're all still trying to work our way out of that pain. Now, business schools aren't fully to blame for that, but we're partially to blame. And so, to me, this is an amazing moment to actually think about the convergence of these issues. The global economy that we sit in, and the ways in which corporations play a major role in shaping the world that we live in. Make no mistake about it, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool capitalist. I believe fundamentally in the importance of business and the importance of corporations and the importance of capitalist institutions. But we need to be thinking responsibly about what it means to go out and be the stewards, the people who run these organizations that are the most powerful institutions in the global economy. And so my entire career has been about those two issues. My entire career has been about, on the one hand, China. I'm first and foremost a China scholar. When I was your age, I was studying Mandarin Chinese at the University of Chicago and preparing myself for a life that was committed to understanding the economic development of the world's what would be later the world's most powerful emerging economy. But at the same time, how should I understand that system? And that's actually how I got into a field called organizational sociology, which was really about stepping beyond narrow thinking in economic theory, but thinking instead about economic aspects of how organizations become very functional instruments, but also appreciating the social context and the system in which these organizations are embedded. Right? So those two things kind of have been the main driving force in my career, but as the world economy started to get more and more complicated, people like me who are a little bit on the margins of business schools and on the margins of academia actually started to be heard a little bit more. And so I found myself here. And to my mind, there's no place that's more interesting to have this kind of conversation than in Washington, D.C. And there's no business school that I'd rather be a part of than this one, that I think is taking a leading role in thinking about those issues. Now, how does that relate to the things that I want to talk to you about tonight? One of the core features of what I do, this issue, the convergence of these issues of global capitalism, but running effective organizations within this system, is really about leadership as a feature of running effective organizations. And because you all are preparing yourselves, whether you're a freshman right now or whether you're a senior and thinking about what you're going to be doing next year, you are here to prepare yourself for a very complex and turbulent market. So hopefully some of the things that I talk about today can give you a little bit of a skill set or a little bit of a framework to think about some of these issues. So when you go out into the world, into the work world, you actually have some tools to play with. And you will probably hear some of these ideas in your classes. So maybe for those of you who are early on in your career, if you're academically, this is just a precursor to what you might hear later. Now, before I get involved deeply in this conversation, I always like to start off with a question about what is leadership? We hear about it all the time today. People are obsessed with it. If you Google the term, you'll see thousands and thousands of books that have been written on leadership in the last decade. Leadership is to today what strategy was in the 80s and 90s. Strategy was the hot topic back then, and today everybody thinks actually strategy is all well and good, but if you don't have a way of implementing in the organization, then it's not going to be very meaningful. So I always like to start with this question, because it's such a popular term. What is leadership? Again, this is not a rhetorical question. I'm not above cold calling either, so. What do you think? Yes?
Being proactive, taking initiatives, leading quality towards reaching objectives.
Leading a group towards reaching an objective and being proactive, taking initiative. Okay? What do you think leadership is? Yeah. Being an engaged member of your group. Okay? Yeah.
Not just like just giving directives, but also understanding what you're trying to accomplish and helping explain that from your position of experience.
Okay, so not just giving orders, but actually helping people to understand what it is that they're trying to accomplish and doing that from a perspective that where you understand your own context and everybody else's. Okay? Another. Sir.
I think it's also embodying the values and qualities that you'd like to see in leadership as well.
Okay, so basically modeling what you want people to live. Okay? Any other views? Yeah.
Being able to maximize your resources and team to your best extent.
Now, why do you say maximize your resources in your team? What do you mean by that?
Well, if you're a team of people, you want to make sure that everyone's doing their absolute best and what they're trained to do.
So on some level, you have an organizational objective, but then you have, as you put it, resources, which are human capital, and you need to then be able to help them achieve and maximize within that system. Okay? Yes?
Being an effective communicator to your team.
Okay. Effective communication. It's actually one of the things that a lot of leaders do very poorly. But for sure. Yeah, please. Okay, so actually bringing together people so they recognize what the goal is, and then ultimately bringing that group to be effective in achieving that goal. Yeah.
Finding the strengths of your group so that they can work efficiently to achieve their goal.
Okay. Now, it's very interesting that all of you are actually talking about this on a micro level, which I like, because one of the things that I want you to walk away from this conversation today is that you might think, I'm 18 years old. Why do I care about leadership? I'm just worried about getting a job. I mean, I don't really want to worry about what leadership is in terms of, that's like 20 years away from me. And what I would like for you to walk away from this conversation today is that leadership is not about the position that you're in. It's about your mindset in terms of how you approach everything you do in life. For whether you're in a work group, in class, or in a classroom setting, or interacting with a secretary in the school, or when you're in your internship, how you actually take initiative on the job, how you interact with the client. These things are all the fundamentals of leadership, and that is about you today. So one of the biggest things I used to do a lot of advising with companies on these issues of talent development and career trajectories of junior people within organizations. One of the things that was always so amazing to me is that leadership failures happen because everybody is waiting to be anointed as a leader. When what needs to happen is that people need to step up and claim leadership from this moment going forward. And that doesn't have anything to do with age. It doesn't have anything to do with how deep you are into your career. It doesn't have anything to do with how senior you are in an organization. The lowest level person in an organization can be a leader precisely because they decide to be, and they decide to approach their tasks and their job and their vocation and their interactions with people in a leadership fashion. And to me, this is the most important thing in leadership, and it's the thing we teach the least. So I just want to talk through a couple of the core concepts here about that, but that's the core thing that I want you to take away. That's the takeaway point. So right now I've given you the conclusion, so you can all go to sleep now. But that's the main takeaway, okay? Now, let's just jump into a couple of ideas. I've shortened this from how I normally do these talks, but I want to just kind of run through a couple of myths of leadership and then give you a basic framework, and then we'll cut off there, and then I'll open it up to some questions about some issues. Okay? The first thing is, I like to kind of just get a starting point of talking about leadership. Who said this? Anybody know? Some see things the way they are and ask why. I dream things that never were and ask why not. It's my favorite leadership quote. Anybody? Come on. Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure, but it sounds like a JFK quote.
Okay, very close guess. Very good. It's actually a quote from George Bernard Shaw, but it's one that Bobby Kennedy actually used when he was on the campaign trail. And it was about changing the world. So there is something here that's really about the question of stepping up and claiming leadership for yourselves starting today. But there's also something to my mind that leadership is about that's about dreaming. And in some ways, that's what this school is about to my mind. This is why I came here. I didn't come here to build a top 20 business school. We will do that along the way, but I came here to be a part of an institution that is going to change the world. And that might sound grandiose in terms of thinking about where we are, but I actually believe that institutions can change the world and people within institutions can change the world. And if we dream big, we can do those things together. And that's, to me, what Bobby Kennedy was about as well. Now, if we want to talk through what effective leadership means, I think we need to talk about what it means and how we define it. We need to talk about a couple of myths. The first myth is that it's about the individual. This is the most common thing you'll hear, especially when I used to spend a lot of time talking to junior people within organizations, and I would talk about career trajectories and try to figure out what was wrong with the organization and why things weren't working well. And I would talk to people individually, and they would say, I'm just not a leader. It's just not me. I'm not charismatic. People don't follow me. Right? Maybe some of you have even felt that. But note that that's a very individualistic way of thinking about things. It's very much from the individual psychological approach to things. And that actually comes out of the leadership teaching and literature that dates back to the late 1970s. There was a very famous article written in the Harvard Business Review in probably 1978, 79, that said, managers and leaders, how are they different? And it basically talked about this issue that leaders have specific personal qualities that make them people that are exciting to follow. They have charisma, they have engagement, they have passion. But that's a myth. That's not what leadership is about. There are plenty of great leaders that I've come across in my time in the last 20 years in studying these issues that don't have those personal attributes, but they have different things that they can deploy as a tool set to figure out. So it's not about the individual, and if you think it's purely about the individual, then you're missing what a lot of the big picture is. It doesn't mean that things like charisma aren't advantages in this process, but it does mean that there's a much larger context for thinking about these issues. Second myth. I actually think somebody said this, and it's not untrue in some sense that sometimes you can define a leader as based on whether or not people are following you. Right? Are you a person that's engaging enough such that people listen when you talk? Right? And that might be a useful way of thinking about this. But it may be the case someday that you may be speaking nonsense and walk off a cliff by yourself. Right? That's really not the basis, once again, of what leadership is about. Some people define leadership as the ability to show calm in a crisis. I was in New York 10 years ago, and I remember this very clearly, this day, and the weeks that came after, and how much Rudy Giuliani was anointed as a great leader because he was calm in the midst of a crisis. And sometimes people even talked about him as being great presidential timber because he was so calm on September 11th, 2001. It's a little bit of an odd position to take, however, if you think about it, that we should elect our leaders not based on what they do in day-to-day behavior, but instead what they might do in the infinitesimally small chance that we'll have a crisis. Odd way of thinking, isn't it? But note that contrast. Crisis and extreme moments versus day-to-day activity. Day-to-day activity is actually where the heart of leadership lies, but we often don't think about it that way. There's another way of thinking about leadership that's all about intuition, heart. Mike Krzyzewski has written a lot about this. A lot of his basketball players have talked about how great of a leader he is because he has so much heart, so much intuition. And again, in certain contexts, we know this to be true, that people have certain qualities that we want to follow. But again, those are very individualistic and very particular, and they have very little to do with how organizations are run. Probably the most famous example, especially a decade ago, when I used to teach this topic to executives, a decade ago, if you'd say, who's a great leader of our time? Inevitably, somebody would say Jack Welch, and you say, why Jack Welch? And they would say, wow, you can't argue with 1,500% increase in shareholder value over a 20-year period, right? He made a lot of people rich. How can you argue that case? Okay. Yeah, it's good for shareholders, and especially if you're talking about the era of shareholder capitalism, probably something to think about. It's also interesting to note that post-2001, post-Sarbanes-Oxley, Jack Welch would be arrested for the earnings smoothing that he used to use to run GE. And the interesting thing about Jack Welch, if you look at him in terms of the increase of shareholder value over the course of a 20-year period, you can't argue with him. He is the greatest GE executive of all time. But if you look at him in terms of return on assets, worst. The worst GE executive ever. Now, part of this is because of the way in which capitalism was changing in the 1980s and the ways in which moving deals around and the ways in which we were demanded to follow the whims of Wall Street and quarterly earnings. And Jack Welch was the darling of Wall Street during that time. Right? So there is something to how he figured out the game, but it was a bad game. It's not a productive game, actually. I'm probably the only business school dean who will come out and say that I think capital markets are very, very problematic. I've been known to say in classrooms that they're evil, and I really shouldn't say stuff like that. But they are very problematic. It is amazing to me that our capitalism, how we measure, what's the most important measure of our economy today? What do you wake up and look at every day on CNN or anywhere? The Dow Jones Industrial Average, right? What does it have to do with the productivity of products and goods in the economy? It has a lot more to do with consumer confidence, but it has very little to do with the underlying productivity of organizations. Right? It has to do with whether or not the jobs report is going to come out good or bad. It has to do with whether or not markets in Europe did well. It has to do with whether or not Congress is at odds with the White House. Right? All of which is important for the macroeconomic issues of the economy, but very few people actually understand that the underlying details of what it means to think about productive assets have been completely de-linked from all of those things that are traded. Right? Do you ever hear the concept of day trading? Right? There's very little to do with the actual underlying productive assets. So it's a very interesting context that we live in today. It has very little to do with the productive assets that are the underlying goods of an economy. Okay? So I'm very, very skeptical when people say leaders are great leaders because of shareholder value. Sometimes people think about things like creativity. Who's the greatest creative leader of our time? Steve Jobs. No doubt, right? Here is a man whose creative will, his ability to see a future, his ability to pitch, changed the world, right? There's no doubt that this guy is important, and of course he's important in addition to his creativity. He also did pretty well on the Jack Welch metric of shareholder value over the last 10 years after he came back to Apple, the last 15 years. One of the things that's a very interesting historical secret, it's not really a secret, but most people don't remember, and you guys are too young to remember, that Steve Jobs almost destroyed Apple Computer. If he would have been allowed to stay in Apple Computer in 1985, we would not be talking about Apple Computer today. It's kind of an amazing thing, right? It's a little bit mind-bending. What does that mean? One of the people that we think of as the greatest leaders of our time actually would have destroyed his company when it was too young and too immature to actually withstand the weight of a personality like this, if he wouldn't have been driven out of his company by the board. Now, he came back a decade later and actually seemed to have a different level of self-reflection, and a different level of understanding, and then became the great leader that he is today. But it's an interesting thing to think about leadership because it tells you that leadership is a deeper set of issues than just your ability to think creatively and your ability to drive people towards your vision. So I want to talk a little bit about what these issues are, but before I do that, I want to come back to what I told you was my core thing that I want you to take away. And that is, in the context of all of these things, there is a sixth myth that is really important, which is that leadership is about someone distant and far away, at the top of a pyramid, that I may listen to, but I only hear through a funnel of many, many different chains of command. And that is a complete myth. Leadership is about you today and how you decide to interact at every level of interaction that you engage in. At 18 years old or 22 years old, whatever point you are in your career, or wherever you are, whether it's in the classroom, or in your internship, or in your job that you'll have next May, leadership is there to be taken. It is about how you decide to pick up the phone and interact with the client, how you decide to have the difficult conversations with a colleague that you might not want to have, how you decide to actually manage up when you're dealing with a very, very mercurial and difficult boss like Steve Jobs was back in 1984. All of those things are about leadership, and to the extent that young people take those issues on, they help create healthy organizations. What would the world be like today in terms of the economic crisis if Fabrice Tor, anybody know who Fabrice Tor is? Who remembers? Who is that?
Wasn't he the guy, didn't he have that goofy nickname? He was the guy that kind of like messed everything up. I don't really, I can't give you a very detailed thing.
His nickname might have been something like the Fab. The Fab. He worked for Goldman Sachs.
Yeah, for Goldman Sachs, and he like started the idea.
He didn't start the idea, but he was a little bit older than you guys, about 27, 28 years old. He worked for Goldman Sachs, and he was building mortgage-backed securities. And his bosses were saying, do this. And he was writing emails saying like, dude, this system is messed up. This is all going to come home to roost. This is amazing, right? So now Goldman hasn't paid much for those quote-unquote crimes, and to some extent they've been exonerated. But imagine what the world would be like if every Fabrice Tor said, you know what, I'm not going to do this. This actually doesn't seem so great to me. I'll tell you another story that's really interesting from 2001. Ever hear of a company called MCI? MCI merged with WorldCom and became a $500 million write-down almost overnight. There's a guy I used to bring in to talk to my classes called Welch within 2 years of federal time. Now initially when I announced that he was coming in, people would be like, I have nothing. Why are you bringing that guy in? He's an unethical felon, and I'm not. Right? I was raised in a nice home. I actually understand what's right and wrong. Turns out this guy has the same story. And it turns out that he was going through a process within his organization in which he recognized every time the organization was doing something wrong. And every time he put up his hand and was like, guys, this doesn't seem so great to me. And every time, you know what happened? He was given more responsibility. He said, you know what, this seems like a problem to me that we're doing accounting prices this way. And they said, you know, you should run the department. True story. And eventually he actually did kind of go down a bad road because he thought he was going to be the fall guy at MCI. And he turned states' rights and did 2 years of federal time. But the point is, what would the world be like in those crises if people stood up and said, I'm not going to do these things? Right, and those are people that you will be 4 years from now. So what I like to think about with respect to these issues of corporate social responsibility and corporate citizenship and all these things that sound very grandiose and about the embeddedness of corporations in society, I like to think about, actually, that's you 5 years from now. Now you might think that's not me. I have just got out of school. My degree was expensive. Maybe I have student loans. Like I need to just focus on doing the work. Right? But actually there is a way to lead in those moments. There is a way to lead, and you will come upon it sooner than you think. You will come upon it 4 years from now. And you will be given tasks that you will have to be making choices about how you're going to interact with those tasks. So to me, this is the most important message of what I like to talk about, especially to people at your stage in life. Summary points. Leadership. It's not about the position you're in, it's about how you interact in that position. It's about how you choose to be. It has nothing to do with the structural position that you're in an organization. It's also about everyday action and introspection. It's about actually being able to think about the day-to-day stuff. Don't wait for the grand moment when you're going to be asked to step up and take a leadership role. Actually, it's about how you interact with your colleague today who's a member of your study group. It's about organizational interests. Organizations are complex systems, and how you actually disentangle that complexity and then figure out a way through that psychological and human complexity is really at the heart of it. It's about how you empower other people and really make them help other people learn how to sing within organizations. And it's ultimately also about embracing complexity and analysis. For too long, over the last 30 years, this is to bring us back to the question of neoclassical economic theory, we have lived in the world that simplifying through assumptions is the right way to build complex mathematical models. That might be true, except the problem with that is that the world is fundamentally complex. And we actually need to embrace that complexity and look for opportunities within it. And it's about listening, caring, and understanding. Now, I'm going to kind of jump through the final point because there are kind of 3 key addenda that I like to take us through in these. Over the last couple of years, I've become much more attuned to the issues of introspection. Introspection's a hard one. And as I said, I try to teach away from the internal psychological aspects of organizations, but it is important that you know who you are. And at 18 years old, you're probably just figuring out who you are or who you're going to be. But continue to struggle for that. Continue to struggle to be able to look in the mirror and be honest. I've worked with some of the most charismatic university presidents in the world who are the most unintrospective people. Not Steve Knapp. I think Steve Knapp is actually a great president. But my former president at NYU was a guy who was unbelievably charismatic, but he was so unintrospective. He was like one of these guys who was amazing. I'm sure you've maybe experienced someone like this before, where you walk into a room and he'll say, oh, maybe this is what I'm doing. He'll walk into a room and say, this is really about you. And then he'll talk for 57 minutes out of 60. That really tells me I'm going to cut off. No, the important thing is that I know that I do that. So know who you are. Okay? I'm going to finish up really quick. My favorite book on leadership is not actually a book on leadership, but I would recommend for you a book by Catherine Schultz called Being Wrong. It is the big thing that is missing in organizational life today. It is so hard for leaders to admit that they've made mistakes, but it is the most powerful thing you can do within organizations. And it feels counterintuitive when you're doing it, but it's actually a crucial part of what we do.